One of the saddest moments in most business owners and entrepreneurs' lives is that moment when they decide that they want to go sell their company. And either A, they can't find anyone who wants to buy it. And in fact, 80% of companies that try to be sold aren't sold. Or B, someone might want to give you some money, but the amount of money they want to give you is way less than the amount of money that you think your company is worth. This happens all the time. I'm frequently the recipient of that conversation where someone's frustrated. I thought this was valuable. It's not. Or I thought this was valuable, but no one wants to buy that. So what I want to do in this episode of Growth School Podcast is I want to help you avoid that moment. I don't want you to experience the sadness of no one wants to buy it or they don't want to give me much money for it. I want to encourage you to engineer your company in such a way that someone is going to want to pay you a lot of money for it. In other words, you're going to have a boatload of people who want to give you a boatload of cash. And that happens if you engineer your company for maximum value, what is known as maximum enterprise value. So if that sounds interesting to you, that you would not like to be sad and you'd like to be happy, that you wouldn't want a small amount of money, but you'd like to get a maximum amount of money for your company, then I want to encourage you to listen closely and intently to this episode of the Growth School Podcast, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. How do you maximize the value of your company? And by the way, it doesn't matter if you want to sell your company next year, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. It's irrelevant. If you engineer your company the right way, when the time comes, and at some point you're going to want to sell your company, you'll be able to get the maximum value because for the last X number of years, you've been engineering it. So a lot of people are going to want to give you a lot of cash for it. All right, that said, there are three things you need to do. Number one, you need to understand the rules of the game. You need to understand how the game is played. The challenge for a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs is they tend to create the business that they want to create, which makes sense. It's your business. Why not design it the way you want it to be designed? Fair enough. The problem, of course, is that people don't buy what you want to sell. People buy what they want to buy. And so in this case here, you wake up and you think that your company, let's say it's a $3 million a year company, is worth $3 to $5 million. And they're saying, no, it's not even close to that. And you're thinking, what? That makes no sense. Well, they're not buying what you want to sell. They're buying what they want to buy. So how is the game played? In general, and there are exceptions to every rule, but in general, people are going to pay you a multiple of your profits. So in this case here, let's say you have a $3 million a year business, and let's say you have a 10% operating profit margin. And by the way, we're not going to mess around with SD, seller's discretionary earnings, or EBITDA or EBIT. We're just going to talk about operating profit because in general, you probably know what that number is. You see it when you pull out your QuickBooks and you go to the bottom and you say, there's my operating profit. All right. So let's just say it's 10%. So you're throwing off $300,000 of cash. They're going to pay you then a multiple of that. And a typical small business multiple is going to be 3 on operating profit. So 300,000 times 3, that's going to give you about $900,000. You're thinking, I should be getting 3 million. No, the game is played because people are buying your cash flow and they're going to give you a multiple of that cash flow. So in this case here, they might give you $900,000. And that's usually when people say, I don't like the way this game is played. Well, you got to know how the game is played because then you can engineer your company to take advantage of those 3 variables that we just talked about. So let's take a look at the first one. It's always about your revenue. It's of the 3, it's the smallest, least important one. So if you had $3 million and you had a 10% operating profit and you had a 3 multiple, if you increase the 3 million to 5 million over the next, let's say, 3 years, now all of a sudden that 300,000 is now 10% of 5 million, which is 500,000, and then you're getting a 3 multiple of that, you get 1.5. So simply by increasing your revenue, you're going to get a larger number. Second variable is actually more important, and that's your operating profit percentage. So let's say you could grow it from 10 to 20% just to make the math simple. So instead of $300,000 of cash, you're now throwing off $600,000 of cash. If they paid you that same 3 multiple, you now get 1.8. So that sounds a lot better. Okay, so you're just moving up because now you've just increased the operating percentage. But the most important of the 3, because if you use math, it's your revenue minus your expenses gives you your operating profit, and then it's that number is multiplied. The multiple is going to be the bigger factor, the multiple. And let's say that you have a 3 multiple right now. Well, there are a number of things that you can do to increase the multiplier that somebody's going to use. And let's say you could increase that from a 3 to a 5. So now you've got the $5 million a year business times the 20% profit. Now you're shooting off $1 million of cash. Oh, that sounds a lot better. And then you with the multiplier, you now go from a 3 to a 5x. Now someone's willing to pay you $5 million for the same company. They were only going to give you $900,000 a couple years earlier. So that's how the game is played. You have three variables that you can play with. How can I drive revenue? How can I increase my profitability? And then how can I improve the multiple? And if you understand that's how the game is played, and that's what people are going to pay you, a multiple of your operating profit or EBITDA or SDE, once you understand that, now you can begin to engineer the game. All right, so that's step number one. You need to understand the rules of the game, how it's played. Step number two, if you want to create maximum value and you know that the multiplier is the important one, then you want to think like a buyer, not like an owner. Think like a buyer, not like an owner. Remember what we said, most of us as business owners and entrepreneurs think about what we want to create, but people don't buy that. They buy what they want to buy. So the more that we can give somebody the thing that they want to buy, the higher the multiple is going to be, because they're going to want to give us more money for what they want, not what we want to offer. So if the multiplier is the big number, what are some things that increase the multiple, the thing that somebody is willing to multiply your profitability by? Well, there are a handful of things, and you can Google them if you want, but I'll give you a couple here. People like to pay more for recurring revenue. And by the way, if you want to think about this really simply, everybody wants to maximize the value and the upside, and they want to minimize the downside. So if you're thinking about what can we do to increase the probability of them making more money and reduce the probability of them losing money, you're going to do well. So the first thing would be recurring revenue, whether it's monthly recurring revenue, MRR, or annual recurring revenue, ARR, either one. People are going to pay more for that because it's not episodic. They don't have to go out and get it every week or every month because they got recurring revenue. So someone's going to pay a higher multiple. If that's true, then you're going to think, hey, I got to get some more of that. Another thing that they'll pay more for is they'll pay for a company that's systematized, right? If your company is not systematized and you've got a bunch of intellectual property in the hands and heads of a couple people, well, what happens if they leave? Well, if they leave, then as the company that bought them, well, I'm in trouble. Now we've got to find somebody else. We've got to create the systems. That's a lot of work. But if your company is completely systematized, then someone's going to buy it. They're going to say, hey, if somebody leaves, not a problem. The playbook already is designed. Hey, all we have to do is insert the playbook, give somebody that, and then they're going to be able to get up to speed quickly. So I'm going to pay more for a systematized business than I'm going to pay for an unsystematized business. Remember, they want big upside and they want to minimize their downside. Another thing people will pay more for is if you have a big brand or you have big market share. People know you in your market space. So the more that you invest money, time, effort into building your brand and brand awareness, someone's going to pay more for that than they'll pay for a company that no one really knows or isn't aware of the name, because then they've got to spend more money on doing that. Okay, that makes sense. The more that your company is dependent on you, the less someone's going to pay, right? Because when you sell the company, you're leaving. So if you want to get a higher multiple, then you want to build a self-operating business so that when you're gone, the company still runs. And by the way, if you're struggling with this, I'd encourage you to pick up my self-operating business playbook. It's minimal cost. You just go to bizscalers.com/playbook, and you can get the playbook right there. Minimal cost, but now you're going to build a business that can run without you. And if you do that over the course of the next couple of years, someone's going to pay you a higher multiple for that. So all you need to do is start thinking about what are all the different things that I could do that somebody would want to buy. And if I put those things in place, they're going to want to pay me a higher multiple. Another one, for example, would be having a good executive top team. So if you look at your top team and you say, would anyone want to buy this team? And the answer is no. Then you'd say, hey, over the next 12, 24, 36 months, how can I either develop them or how can I change them out to get some people that a buyer would want to buy? Because they'd say, hey, if I'm buying the company, this group of people is incentivized and they're adequate and they're really good at what they do. So now I don't have to run the company. They can run the company. I'm going to pay more for that than I would a company where I have to invest a lot of time, effort, and energy in. So once you understand how to play the multiple game, you start engineering your company now so that somebody's going to want to give you a higher multiple. And once you get that in place, then you get to move on to the step 3. And step 3 is really simple. You need to simply design and execute your maximum value plan. Whatever you want to call your plan, come up with some fancy name if you want. You're simply trying to look at those 3 variables and saying, how can I increase each one of these? Because if I multiply all of those together, I'm going to get a much better number at the end of the day. So what I would do is take out a sheet of paper and say, okay, over the next 3 years, or whatever time frame you want, the next 3 years, what am I going to do to drive growth? And come up with a bunch of different strategies. Now, one of the things that people will pay more for is a company that is only in a handful of niches or only a handful of products. Rarely does a company want to buy somebody who's doing 30 things, because usually they'll want 1, 2, or 3 of those things, and they don't want all the other things. So the more that you're focused in driving growth with a handful of products and services and a handful of niches, you're going to become a lot more attractive to a buyer. So just figure out, what can we do to really drive growth in a handful of places so that someone's going to want to acquire us? So come up with a bunch of strategies on that. Then number 2, then you want to look at your profitability. And that would be, what are the things that I can do to decrease my cost structure on a percentage basis so I have more profitability left over? Now, the one thing that I would encourage you when you're working on your cost reduction is, some companies get really cost reduction happy and they try to cut out as much as they can because they want to increase the profitability of the company. The problem is that you can cut so much that no one actually wants to work at your company. And who would want to buy that company, right? No one wants to buy a skinned cat that is starving and its ribs are showing through. No one wants to do that. So don't do that to your company, right? What I would recommend is pick a profit percentage that you think a buyer would want. Let's say if 10 is normal, let's say 15% or maybe 17%, maybe max 20. And pick whatever that is, and then budget toward that, and then feel free with spending money, right? It's okay that you can spend money on pizza for your people, right? It's okay that you can spend some money to attract really good talent. It's okay to spend money to build your brand. So pick a profit percentage and then be okay with spending money outside of that. Don't go cost hungry and try and say, hey, man, we got up to 45% profitability. Yeah, but no one wants to work here. So just be careful on the cost one. That's number 2. And then the third part then is just come up with strategies to increase the multiple. Like, what do we need to do to create some more recurring revenue? Or what do we need to do to better systematize this company over the next 3 years? What do we need to do to get me out of the center of this company? Or what do I need to do to build this top team of people? Or how do I need to incentivize them? So just walk through that list. You can always Google and find factors that influence the multiple. But I would encourage you to just come up with a simple plan. Put it on one piece of paper and look at each one of those 3 things. And then for the next 3 years, drive everything toward that. Because at that moment, you're probably going to have more revenue, you're probably going to have more profitability, and you're going to have a more attractive company. It'll be more fun for you, regardless of whether you don't want to sell for the next 10 or 15 years. But if something were to happen and you wanted to sell, you'd get the maximum value because you've now built a company that somebody would want to buy. And when you start thinking like that, it's a game changer. So we'll just say 5 years from now, instead of doing 3 million, your company's now doing 10 million. And instead of a 10% operating profit, you're at 20%. So now you're throwing off $2 million. You've systematized, you're no longer at the center, you've got a great team of people running it, you've done all the things we've talked about. Now someone wants to give you a 7 multiple on that. So instead of 3, instead of getting 6 million, now someone's going to pay you 14 million. And maybe even 10. So you might get 20 million. Like, you can change everything if you start designing your business so that it's maximized value, so that when somebody wants to buy, they're going to buy the company that you've produced. So I hope you found this week's edition of Growth School really helpful, very practical. If you haven't subscribed yet, whether you're listening to it on podcast or you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you have some other business owners that you know, make sure you pass this on to them so that they don't have that sad moment, but they can have the happy moment like you want to have. And then make sure you watch this other video on maximizing value by dominating your market, because the more market share you have, the more someone's going to want to pay you as well. And until next week, to your accelerated success, Bruce out.